Although, of course, my wish here is that you don't take the remarks of certain congressional leaders seriously, in the same way that their bullying tactics should be called out, their idea or utter ignorance of journalism, particularly the normative standards of the profession, should be clarified as early as now. So press freedom, as we all know, is said to be a cornerstone of democracy. So there are individual and organizational levels when we talk about cornerstone. First, press freedom allows journalists to report and interpret issues and events based on the professional and ethical standards. So when we talk about normativity in journalism, basically it's just how the profession should be practiced. So that's where the standards would come in. That's the reason why at the campus press level, you tend to assess your journalistic outputs along the lines of form and content. Is the grammar, syntax, and diction up to par? Are the contents and the intended messages of the journalistic outputs clear? So these are what we call professional standards. But ethical standards would be another dimension in terms of responsibility in journalism because ethics would define how we go about news gathering as well as editing and designing and laying out our outputs, or even how to upload on social media as well as on your official website. Ethics would be an important factor in terms of shaping public opinion. So no amount of congressional legislation would be necessary to regulate journalism. Don't get me wrong, by all means, we should try our best to control ourselves. We should police our ranks. So the only form of regulation that is acceptable in journalism would be self-regulation. That's about it. Now, the second level of cornerstone of democracy would be the organizational level, wherein press freedom allows for the free operation or independent operation based on uh, based on freedom from government intervention. So as mentioned a while ago, ethics cannot be legislated in any way. In the same way that newsroom operations should also not be legislated, and we should always oppose any tendency from the government to intervene in terms of content. The most recent decision by the National Telecommunications Commission to question ABS-CBN having a block time arrangement with Ankara, for example, or Channel 43, is a cause for concern because right now the NTC is sending a chilling message not just to ABS-CBN but to all other news media organizations that they have the right to regulate block time arrangements, and that in the end, the not so pleasant message that we're getting from the government is that they have the right to determine what should be the programming sequence of a particular broadcast station. So therein lies that particular problem. So the key elements, on the other hand, of press freedom would be editorial independence and self-regulation. So when we say editorial independence, we refer to a situation where there are essentially free operations of the media. So there editorially speaking, there are there are certain elements of freedom that would be there for a particular news media organization or the campus press, and that's what would be necessary. By freedom, we mean the situation where there are no interests that are at play in terms of determining media content. Self-regulation, on the other hand, would also be absolutely necessary because, as we noted a while ago, the only form of regulation that would be acceptable in media would be self-regulation. Of course, again, let me stress, self-regulation does not mean absolute freedom because self-regulation would also demand adherence to certain professional and ethical standards. Now, our objective in terms of press freedom would be to ensure an informed, critical, and empowered citizenry. So, press freedom is not just for journalists and media workers. We have to be very, very clear on that. Press freedom is for the general public because we want to keep them informed. We want to make them critical. We want to create a critical mass among audiences. And then we want to also empower them. Now, in the next slide, okay, so we need to also talk about journalism because as we all are all aware, the objective for having press freedom is to have responsible practice of journalism. Now, Edmund Lambeth, in his book, Committed Journalism, an Ethic for the Profession, basically states that there are five basic principles insofar as journalism is concerned. So first would be truth telling. So truth telling basically consists of two kinds of accuracy. So these are contextual accuracy and factual accuracy. So when we say contextual, we refer to an analysis of the issues. We need to make sense of what is happening. Of course, factual accuracy would be the empirical data that we gather, the truth in terms of the information that we're able to get from primary sources, secondary sources, and all that. When we say justice, we refer to fairness in reportage. So sometimes we also talk about objectivity here, but if we want to be more practical in terms of trying to discern and to ferret out the truth, so to speak, then it has to do with fairness. In other words, we are not subjective in terms of our selection of sources, as we will discuss later on. We will not let emotions get in the way of our value judgments when it comes to determining what should be reported, what should not be reported, among many other concerns. Number three, humaneness. Humaneness is a situation where we try to treat sources of information, audiences, actually practically everybody, as human beings worthy of respect. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's okay for journalists to feel angry, to feel disappointed, to feel to feel anything pleasant or unpleasant towards certain people or certain sources of information. But humaneness would dictate upon us to strive for a certain level of professionalism in terms of dealing with people. In other words, you don't just talk to people you like. You have to also talk to people you don't like. And you treat them equally in terms of respect, in terms of courtesy. I mean, even the most despicable dictators, they would have to be interviewed, right? So no matter how much you hate certain people, certain officials, you don't let it get in the way of your professionalism. But of course, with humaneness comes the responsibility of you to criticize or to call out your sources of information. I mean, just because you're being humane doesn't mean that you will compromise being critical. Critical analysis cannot be compromised in any way. Number four, stewardship. Stewardship has to do with you being a good role model in the practice of journalism. So stewardship is more applicable to those in the senior positions. For example, in the case of campus journalists, perhaps these are the section editors, the editors in chief, uh, or any of the writers who may be at the third year or fourth year level. So you have to set a good example to the new ones. You have to make sure that you adhere to the highest standards of the profession so that others will follow suit. So therein lies the importance of stewardship. So the more you become a good role model, the more we see improvement in the profession on the assumption that those who are junior to you would follow in your lead. Last but not the least, of course, is the importance of freedom. Because without freedom, how can we practice journalism? So that's why part of the ethical obligation of journalists would be to fight for freedom, especially when it is being threatened or in situations where it is already dead. Okay, so in a dictatorship, for example, there is no freedom. So what is the option of the journalist? Will a journalist just simply practice the profession in the absence of freedom? No, because if there is no freedom, there is no journalism. The kind of quote unquote journalism that you have would just be basically public relations. Do you want to be glorified stenographers of a particular government? No offense meant to the stenographers, of course, who are doing quite a good job. But again, in journalism, we need to make sure that there is freedom. Because how can we do critical analysis if we are not free to do so? So these five principles more or less define the craft of journalism, which then leads us to the mission of a journalist. You know, it takes 4 years to learn journalism. And sometimes 4 years would not even be enough to learn many of the aspects of journalism. But if we are to summarize the journalism course, we can come up with just a short articulation of what the mission is, and that is to help in the shaping of public opinion by providing the relevant information. So the keyword here would be relevant. It is the duty of the journalist to stay relevant. That's why we are pressured to learn updates on professional standards. We have to take to heart the ethical considerations in practicing journalism. And most important of all, we have to be abreast with what is happening, not just in the country, but also around us. So we have to stay relevant so that we can make sense of the reality. Because if we don't know what's happening around the world, we might think that the crisis besetting the Philippines is something that is just exclusive to us. And that if you travel to another country, you would have a better life or you would be able to seek greener pastures, so to speak. But we all know that there is a world crisis in the sense that the crisis of capitalism, for example, as a mode of production, would be very much evident. And sometimes the illusion of growth in certain countries or in certain territories would have to be deeply analyzed. Do you really want to be the next Singapore, for example? Don't get me wrong, Singapore is economically developed, but in terms of journalism, you know the kind of suppression that is going on in Singapore, right? So do you really want a development at the cost of our basic freedoms? And sometimes those that are subjected to black propaganda would be the ones that are actually more pro people than we think, right? Because if you would notice, Cuba has been the subject of many negative reports through the years. It's not just about the Red Scare. It's about the kind of quote-unquote underdevelopment that it is going through. And yet you wonder, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, Cuba is one of the countries in the world that would be sending their doctors out so that they can help out different countries. And in terms of medicine, in terms of health, Cuba has one of the best medical facilities, right? And even people from the United States, despite the strained relations between the US and Cuba, they would go to Cuba so that their illnesses like cancer would be cured somehow, right? So, these are realities that we have to be aware of so that we can stay relevant, number one, and number two, we can provide relevant reportage. So now that we're clear about the nuances of journalism and press freedom, perhaps it's time to talk about bias because as you are all aware, this was a major topic in the 12th and final hearing regarding the franchise of ABS-CBN. What is unacceptable? In journalism, we try to be objective. We cannot be subjective. So, in the process, what is unacceptable in bias would be subjective bias. For example, you cannot let your emotions get in the way of your reportage. You cannot be too sensational in terms of trying to report on issues because if you're too sensational, you're just after shock value. You're not after providing relevant information. If in journalism, you just want to be famous, you just want to have your byline, every day in your newspaper or in your online publication, you don't belong in journalism because that is very subjective of you. So we need to look at it from the perspective of trying our best to ensure that we will be able to be more objective than subjective. Don't get me wrong, as human beings, we all have our own biases. We all have our own preferences. For example, one person would prefer coffee over tea. One student would prefer squid balls over fish balls. That's fine. That's normal. But you cannot compromise between being in favor of human rights and then being against human rights. One person cannot say that you are in favor of graft and corruption while the other person will be against graft and corruption. Because in journalism, the kind of bias that is acceptable would be inherent bias. And what do we mean by inherent? It's something that's natural. As a journalistic output, we are all aware that editorials are supposed to reflect the stand of a particular publication or news media organization vis-a-vis burning issues of the day. For example, do you support the renewal of the franchise of ABS-CBN? If the answer is yes, then you have to explain it through an editorial. You cannot have an editorial that would say that we are neither for nor against a particular issue. We let the readers decide. You don't do that. Actually, there are some newspapers that do that, right? There are. But it's not acceptable because an editorial by itself is supposed to be clear in terms of its stand. Because if you do not have a stand, what's the point of writing an editorial? That's very basic. An investigative report is meant to, well, as the term suggests, investigate or to dig deeper into certain burning issues of the day. And an investigative report is written to expose certain wrongdoings, certain anomalies. And the tenor of an investigative report, no matter how short or how long it may be, is that it takes a stand against wrongdoing. The main reason you're exposing wrongdoing is because you are against it. Isn't it stupid or idiotic, to say the least, to say that you are writing an investigative report against wrongdoing, but you are neither for nor against wrongdoing, right? So there is that inherent bias. The fact that you're exposing it means that you oppose it, right? So that's why sometimes in journalism, you can get certain lessons from activism, right? Because you expose and you oppose, right? And investigative reportage is also exposing and going against a particular wrongdoing. Another aspect of inherent bias would be the natural bias for the truth. That's why all journalistic outputs are against fake news. Sometimes there are certain legislators who would say that why is it that my quote or my statement would be not covered by the media? If it's a lie, a journalist has two options. You can quote from it, but your obligation is to expose that lie. You would do fact checking within a particular journalistic output. Or the other option is you don't just quote it altogether because your duty to your readers or to your audiences would be to just simply provide the truth. As I told you a while ago, it's all about relevant information. Is there something relevant about fake news? None, right? Unless, of course, your name starts with the letter M. Then maybe you would be loving fake news, right? Anyway, neutrality is also a myth in journalism. So we have to stress that because sometimes there are some, unfortunately, journalism teachers, whether at the elementary or high school level, I've encountered them quite a lot. I've met them sometimes. And I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but when you say neutrality, you are assuming that journalists are robots and that everything is value free. No, that's not how it works. When we say neutrality, it defeats the purpose in journalism if you remain neutral because certain unacceptable aspects of society would be tolerated because you're just a fence sitter or you're just standing in the middle. So if there is something wrong, you expose that particular wrongdoing, okay, and then you go against that particular wrongdoing based on how you would be writing your report. If a source is lying, then don't quote the source. Get another one who will say the truth. So that's where value judgments would be most important for a journalist. Perhaps the only neutral aspect of journalism would be diction or syntax. Okay? So what would be an example of neutral diction? For example, instead of saying policeman, you would say police officer. So a more gender neutral term would be more preferred. For example, instead of saying congressman, you say representative or senator, right? So perhaps that particular nuance should be mentioned because that is the only exception that I can think of when it comes to neutrality. With regard to the other aspects of journalism, we maintain the fact that neutrality is a myth. So don't go neutral. There has to be principles involved whenever we make judgment calls in the pursuit of our work as journalists. Of course, we also need to avoid false balance. False balance has to do with uh, the fact that sometimes there are people who would assume that if there is, let's say, 5 minutes of airtime, 2.5 minutes can be allotted to the one who is in favor of a particular issue, and another 2.5 minutes would be for the person against that issue. Or in terms of an article that you're writing, if it's 10 paragraphs long, 5 paragraphs for the pro, and then another 5 paragraphs, and then the next 5 paragraphs would be the anti. That's not how balance works. And in fact, that is false balance. And sometimes when you choose sources, you only choose official sources of information. So for example, when we say official sources, you only choose government, or you only choose, in the case of the school, the school administrators, and then no one else. That's wrong because we choose sources using several criteria. Actually, there are so many, but for purposes of our discussion, we'll focus on three. First would be credibility. What is the track record of your source? What is the professional or social standing of that source? So credibility or expertise would be important. Number two, variety of sources would also be clear because when we say variety, we mean different sources, multiple sources, but they tend to say different things. And what's good about variety of sources is if you can get experts who are saying, different things, or they sometimes oppose each other, and then you would try to reconcile the different points of view of the sources that you interview. Of course, for practical purposes, it's a given that you talk to sources who are available or those who are willing to talk, right? Because what is the point of secretly taping conversations with your sources if they are not willing to go on record? Okay, so I'm sure you're aware that in codes of ethics of journalists, you have to identify yourself as a journalist before talking to a source, and you have to be clear that everything is on record, right? Anyway, so balance, the genuine balance is you pit experts against experts. You cannot have a situation where you pit experts against idiots, okay, for lack of a better word, or experts versus non-experts if you want to be a bit neutral about it. But I'd rather be more direct and use the term idiots, right? I'm sure you understand. And of course, truth tellers versus truth tellers, not truth tellers versus fake news peddlers. As I mentioned a while ago, if a person is spreading fake news, you are better off not interviewing that person because you will end up giving the impression if you give space to a fake news peddler, then you are contributing to the quote unquote credibility of that person, which is very unacceptable. Now, of course, there are a lot of media related issues. I mean, the pandemic, we have to keep in mind, for example, that virtual pressers with screened questions are being done by the government. And the disadvantage here is that journalists are deprived from asking the hard questions because questions are being pre-screened by the government officials. Media accreditation is being required for those who need to go to quarantine areas. So in the alternative media like Bulatlat, where I serve as associate editor, we oppose this because for us, a press ID should be more than enough to go around quarantine areas. There is now a penalty for spreading false information under the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, Republic Act 11469. So at first, you may say that, well, that's okay to penalize the spread of false information, but if it's not properly defined, what would happen? So even legitimate journalism could be mistaken as false information because there is no clear definition. And that's very dangerous right now because I'm sure you're aware there is even a case of an editor in chief, right, from the UE Don who was accosted by village officials and he was forced to publicly apologize for his critical commentary on social media. And there are some social media users who are being invited to go to the MBI to explain their posts. So we are seeing the chilling effect of such a provision. And of course, the signing of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 is very much a cause for alarm in journalism because even critical journalism could be misconstrued as, acts of terrorism and it can be punishable by law. So remember, mere suspicion of engagement in terroristic activities could land a person in jail under the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. It also doesn't help that you have a spokesperson who was rehired recently who would take pot shots at media whenever he sees fit. And sometimes we have to be watchful of such officials who would tend to, compromise the truth by providing a spin to practically everything. So it doesn't help in terms of news gathering. So that's why you listen to what the spokesperson or the president say, but at the same time you try to discern what they don't say, and then you work on your article. So instead of mass testing, we have mass arresting. Instead of contact tracing, you have social media tracing or critic tracing. Instead of isolation and treatment, you have mass detention and maltreatment. So that kind of an atmosphere should be clearly appreciated by the journalist so that you can properly contextualize whatever it is that you're writing. And of course, let's not forget the red baiting that's happening. It's still going on, and we have to continue denouncing that because it doesn't help in terms of our productivity as journalists and our duty to shape public opinion. There are two important dates that we need to talk about, May 5 and June 15. So we know the closure of ABS-CBN on that fateful day. And of course, the killing of Cornelio Pepino, let's not forget that. He's a radio journalist based in Dumaguete City. So under the Duterte administration, Pepino was the 16th journalist killed. So we hope that there will be no more journalists added to the growing list of work-related killings. June 15 was the cyber libel conviction of Ressa and Santos of Rappler. So these are two important dates because these would spell the death knell for press freedom or even for democracy in general. So that's why the duty of the journalist, even for campus journalists, would be to continue ensuring that we keep the flames of press freedom burning. Because we are faced right now with a new normal where there is targeted harassment that results in a chilling effect. When you say chilling effect, it's just simply at the back of your head you're asking who's next. Would I be next? If not me, who? Remember, ABS-CBN, Rappler, and the Philippine Daily Inquirer have something in common. Number one, they were all specially mentioned by Duterte in his State of the Nation address in 2017. One is a leading network, the other is a leading website, and the other is the leading daily. So it's possible that the government is making an example out of the three so that other news media organizations will toe the line. That's why when we talk about chilling effect, we say that an attack on one is an attack on all. It's not necessary for a dictatorship to attack everybody in media. You just need to choose among them so that you can force everybody to toe the line. Right now, under the new normal, we are faced with weaponization of laws and the bureaucracy. So attacks have become legal and systematic. Just like franchise renewal, it's supposed to be a ministerial thing. And if you go by the experience of the other news media organizations, it's supposed to be smooth sailing. But what makes ABS-CBN franchise renewal different from the rest? It's because ABS-CBN is at the crosshairs of the sitting president and compared to the other news media organizations, ABS-CBN has been known for its critical reportage. Although, of course, we have to qualify that this kind of critical reportage would still leave much to be desired, but nevertheless, it's very critical. We are also seeing culture of impunity and the reign of tyranny right now in the country. So much as this is the new normal, it's not as if we will begin to accept it and embrace it and then just try to live with it. No, we need to resist. If there is culture of impunity, there should be culture of resistance among people and among journalists as well. Because it is the duty of the journalist to fight for freedom in the absence of freedom. Creative action should be done. Parliamentary and extra-parliamentary struggle should be pursued, online and offline. Of course, keeping in mind physical distancing and other health and safety protocols and safety measures, right? We need to sustain public pressure. So in the short term, we need to junk the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 because it's very much anti-freedom, anti-people, anti-media even. The 25-year franchise for ABS-CBN would still need to be pushed. Even if there, I understand there might be, Congress might be voting on it as we speak right now, but if it cannot be granted under the new administration, we would still appeal to the courts, and even if it takes the next administration, then we shall try to push through with it. In the same way, we need to push for the acquittal of Reza and Santos, and of course, make make our schools safe spaces rather, for campus journalism and mass action. And as a member of the alternative media, perhaps I should add as a short-term goal the need to have justice to certain alternative journalists right now. I refer to Frenchie Cumpio, Executive Director of Eastern Vista. I know her personally. She's currently detained in the Visayas region, and we hope that she will be released. I think you know the reason why she was arrested, right? Because she was suspected of being a sympathizer of the communists, which is not true. Our long-term goal is, of course, to decriminalize libel, to denounce the red baiting that's going on, and of course, to end impunity. And finally, we need to fight tyranny, all manifestations of dictatorship. Because in journalism, what we need to keep in mind as early as now, given that our audience would be, campus journalists, your duty as a campus journalist is not just to do your job or to submit reports, to write or to report. Part of your responsibility is also to fight for what is right. And what is right is to exercise journalism in an atmosphere of press freedom. That's all. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much, Professor Danilo. No? So, ayun po, fellow campus journalists, we have seen how should how journalists should stand amid the attacks, uh, maski ano pa yan na parang perpetrated by the state or any groups. Uh, Yun yung isa sa mga mahalaga na ipinunto ni Sir Danny kanina ay yung pakikipaglaban para sa malayang pamamahayag and even in the absence of press freedom, no. So thank you so much, sir. Pero ano may mga questions po dito sa ating chat box. Unahin ko lang po sabi, tanong po ni Patricia Angela, sabi po niya, question lang po related po sa topic kanina. Do you think, sir, na yung pag-regulate po ba ng airwaves dito sa Pilipinas is a form of government intervention? Tama po ba na may ganito pang pag-apply pa ng franchise for broadcast media?
Okay, that's a good question. Ganito yan, sa usapin ng airwaves, we have to acknowledge the fact that these are finite resources. So there should be some form of regulation in terms of how to allocate the frequencies for television and radio. given na yan talaga. Insofar as the airwaves are concerned, there has to be a form of regulation. Perhaps the question could be better phrased by asking, tama ba na yung Kongreso ang magtatakda ng prangkisa? Kailangan ba talaga ang prangkisa? Kasi sa ibang bansa, tulad ng Estados Unidos, hindi na kailangan ng prangkisa mula sa Kongreso. FCC na, yung Federal Communications Commission, ang siyang nagtatakda ng frequency na i-assign sa mga istasyon. Kaya dapat meron tayong isang mekanismo na yung National Telecommunications Commission ang siya nang magtatakda at ang siya nang magpo-process ng mga aplikasyon para sa frequency. Tanggalin na natin yung congressional power for granting franchises, pero dapat meron ding gagawing independent body yung NTC. Ibig sabihin, hindi ito dapat, dati kasi ang NTC under Office of the President. Right now, with the establishment of the DICT, yung Department of Information and Communications Technology, meron ng sitwasyon na ang NTC ay under DICT na. But whether it's DICT or Office of the President, it's still a government agency. So, mainam sana gawin natin independent commission. Yung National Telecommunications Commission, parang Commission on Human Rights halimbawa, na kumukuha ng funding mula sa gobyerno, pero merong certain level of independence, hindi siya nagpapadikta sa mga nasa kapangyarihan. Pero siguro bilang panghuli, gusto ko lang linawin na with the advances of technology right now, pagka ikaw ay nag-ere through the internet or through cable, hindi mo na kailangan ng congressional franchise sa kasalukuyang panahon. So, yun yung kailangan nating linawin. So, dito, yung mga gumagamit lang ng terrestrial broadcast, yung ibig sabihin ng terrestrial broadcast, kailangan mo talaga ng physical connection dun sa airwaves. Kasi marami sa mga channel ngayon, digital na yung iba sa internet na nanggagaling. Yung wala ng physical cable na kailangan at hindi mo na kailangan ng airway. So, yun yung kailangan i-clarify sa puntong ito. Thank you.
So, thank you, Sir Danny. I hope na nasagot ni Sir Danny Paula yung tanong mo. Next question naman, sir, regarding po sa objectivity is a myth from Ian Kevin Castro. Tanong niya po, sir, what describes the fine line between neutrality and impartiality?
Okay. When it comes to neutrality, dangerous yan para sa mga periodista kasi pag sinabing neutral ka, wala ka talagang posisyon sa isang issue. Iba yung walang posisyon sa patas na pag-uulat. Pag impartial ka, ibig sabihin, you are trying to be as balanced or as you are trying to be as fair as possible in terms of how you report a particular issue. Ibig sabihin, kinuha mo yung iba't ibang panig at sinikap mong makuha yung kanilang mga importanteng mga pahayag. So between impartiality and neutrality, ang mahalagang elemento sa periodismo would be being impartial. Yung neutral, ulitin natin na delikado yan. And in fact, meron ng kasabihan, di ba? Neutrality is a stand by itself, it is a stand in favor of the status quo. So parang by default, pag neutral ka, parang nagiging supportive ka sa status quo.
Thank you, sir. Next question po, mula naman po kay Nathalie Paras. Sabi niya po, question lang po, if schools are supposed to be safe spaces for campus journalism and close and open parentheses by implication is an expression itself, why do school administrators restrain us from doing so? Example, like not allowing certain articles or issues to be published.
Okay. That's exactly the point. Sabi natin, schools are supposed to be safe spaces. But right now, these are dangerous spaces for campus journalism because of weaponization of certain laws. The supreme irony right now is that the 1991 Campus Journalism Act, which is supposed to promote and uphold campus press freedom, is the very law that is used to suppress campus press freedom. So yun yung napaka-ironic na sitwasyon. And that would partly explain why there are efforts from, for example, from Kabataan Party List to come up with a new Campus Press Freedom Act, which I think should be supported. Naabutan ko na itong Campus Press Freedom Act in the previous Congresses pa eh. Tapos nirefile na lang yata under Sara Elago, di ba? Under this new Congress. Pero hindi siya maipasa-pasa eh. So that's why the challenge for the likes of CEGP and other organizations that want to uphold press freedom, campus press freedom, would be to push for the enactment of the Campus Press Freedom Act so that school administrators will be forced to respect campus press freedom. Sa kasalukuyang panahon, kapag may restraint na pinagdaraanan yung mga campus journalists, kung hindi kayo inaalaw na mag-publish ng mga artikulo, dapat na igiit po ninyo, politely I hope, yung inyong karapatan bilang campus journalist. Kasi while the Campus Journalism Act is far from perfect and is used to oppress, sometimes we can maximize certain provisions of the Campus Journalism Act na we can invoke it sometimes to ensure that campus press freedom would be maintained, particularly yung Declaration of Principles under the CJA.
In addition lang din sir, dun regarding dun sa pag-restrain ng mga campus journalists sa mga pamantasan at universidad ay isa sa mga kaya naman isa sa mga pinupush po natin sa CEGP katuwang yung Kabataan Party List ay yung pagbasa po ng Campus Press Freedom Bill na sa mahabang panahon mula nang maipasa o may sa batas itong Campus Journalism Act of 1991 ay isa siyang batas na toothlessness na kung na imbis sana na mas kakalinga at mas protekta sa karapatan at welfare ng mga campus journalists ay nagiging ito pa po yung kasangkapan ng Estado para lalong supilin yung ating mga campus journalists upang maglathala ng mga kritikal na mga pahayagan. So, yun, sir. Thank you, sir. So, balik po, next questions po natin ay follow-up questions po dun kanina. Sir, how can a campus journalist be safe from libel when reporting a non-malicious critical news, especially when it's the court judge who decides whether or not there is presence of malice?
Okay. Siyempre, mahalaga yung pag-iingat dun sa pagre-report. Siguraduhin lang na totoo lahat ng mga sinulat nyo. Make sure that your articles are factually and contextually accurate. Kaya lang ganito, ayoko namang masyadong takutin yung mga campus journalists. Kaya lang, sa karanasan namin bilang mga periodista, kahit na napakaingat mo, kung talagang yung mga nasa kapangyarihan gusto kang kakasuhan at kakasuhan ka pa rin. So, yun yung medyo nakalulungkot sa kasalukuyang panahon. Parang ABS-CBN din yan, di ba? Sabi ng BIR, nagbayad naman ng buwis. Pero, yung ilang kongresista, paulit-ulit na sinasabi na ba't di kayo nagbabayad ng buwis? Di ba? Sabi nila, Pinoy si Gabi Lopez, pero pinagpipilitan. Hindi, Amerikano yan, di ba? So, parang ganun din yung libel. Kaya siguro, ang parang safety na makukuha natin from libel would be this. Number one, continue your critical reportage. Siyempre, maging maingat. Siguraduhin na tama lahat. Siguraduhin na properly observe yung tinatawag nating gatekeeping process, yung pag-edit, pagpa-fact check ng lahat ng mga sinusulat natin. Make sure that everything is true. Make sure everything is not really subject to factual or contextual challenges. So, una yon. Pangalawa, kapag tayo ay mayroong threat of libel, agad nating ipagbigay alam nito sa ating mga patnugot. Halimbawa, kung yung faculty advisor nyo medyo friendly naman sa inyo, ipagbigay alam nyo rin yun sa inyong faculty advisor, pati na rin sa principal o sa mga otoridad ng eskwelahan. Kung idedemanda po kayo ng libel, make sure that there is the publication behind you and that the organization like CEGP or any other group would be behind you as well. Kasi ang pinakamahirap na sitwasyon para sa isang campus journalist yung nakasuhan ka na nga ng libel tapos parang iiwanan ka ng parang, ano ba yun? Parang you are left hanging, so to speak. So parang mag-isa ka na lang. Yung parang bahala ka sa buhay mo, problema mo yan. Hindi dapat ganon. So dapat malinaw ang usapan sa level ng campus publication kung ano yung gagawin. So that will be part of your, for lack of a better term, safety training among journalists. So pag may nakasuhan, ito yung mga kakausapin nyo. So ako, I cannot speak for other groups like the NUPL or the National Union for People's Lawyers. Pero from what I understand with friends from the NUPL, they are more than ready to assist people, including campus journalists, from any legal problems that they may have. Siguro i-share ko lang, ang naging abogado namin when Bulatlat, Kodaw Productions, Pinoy Weekly, and Alter Media were subjected to cyber attack, and we had to sue two companies involved in the cyber attack. Ayun, mga taga-NUPL po sila. So they were more than willing to help us in our legal fight to have justice dun sa pinagdaanan namin. So I'm confident that NUPL or even CEGP would be there to help out if it's necessary.
Thank you, Sir Danny. Another question naman po about sa yung epekto po ng anti-terror law. This actually in relation din po yung tanong niya. Kasi recently, nung sa Pride protest po, ay isa sa mga hinuli, ay pero palaya din naman kaagad, ay si yung dating intern po ng Manila Today. So napagkamalan po siya ng mga pulis na siya ay kasama. So habang nagko-cover sa during that protest, ang tanong po na ito ay mula kay Shalyn Kyle Manuel. Tanong po niya, now that the terror law will be effective in few days, what would be your advice to journalists, sir, especially in covering protests?
Siyempre, dapat parati kayong, yung pinaka-practical na advice na maibibigay ko, siguraduhin nyo na meron talaga kayong press ID. At saka dapat prominently displayed yung press ID. Huwag niyong itago, isabit ninyo sa, ayun, nakalanyard dapat yan, in other words. Garantiya ba ito na hindi kayo maaaresto? I'm sorry pero mahirap magbigay ng garantiya kasi minsan ang pulis walang sinasanto yan, di ba? Kahit nga sa UP Cebu, dapat na may malinaw na agreement na hindi makakapasok yung pulis at militar nang walang paalam sa administrasyon ng universidad, basta-basta na lang pumasok tapos nag-aresto, di ba, ng mga estudyante dun sa UP Cebu. So, ganun din dito, alam ko yung sitwasyon dun sa Manila Today na intern kasi sa pagkakaalam ko, estudyante siya ng UP Manila. At yung Manila Today kasi ay isa sa mga member organizations din ng Alter Media. So, syempre, just like what I told you about the threat of libel, so we stood behind. Hindi lang Manila Today yung tumulong dun sa estudyante yon, kundi yung buong Alter Media Network talaga. Sinigurado namin na mapapalaya yung estudyanteng yon. Tsaka kami, ang suspicion namin, nagpakilala siya bilang periodista, pero nakita yata na naka-jacket siya ng UP. So parang ewan ko, siguro yung police merong negatibong konotasyon porque taga-UP at nandun sa protest action nandun siya bilang estudyante. But nevertheless, dapat na iginalang yung pagkakaroon ng isang press ID. Pero ang fundamental na issue talaga rito, kaya nga hindi natin dapat iwala yung sitwasyon ng mga periodista sa sitwasyon ng mga ordinaryong mamamayan. A peaceful protest should be tolerated by the government even during the pandemic for as long as there is physical distancing. So, ang issue talaga dito napaka-fundamental. Whether periodista ka o ordinaryong mamamayan, hindi ka dapat inaaresto.
Okay, thank you, sir. Siguro pa we will be entertain last two more questions from our participants. So, another question, sir, in follow-up na lang din po dito. Mula kay Kevin, what do you think po, sir, is the future of press freedom in our country, knowing that journalists who are media watchdogs are being targeted left and right?
Okay. Well, syempre, sabi ng iba, this is a bad time to practice journalism because we are, yun nga, as you correctly mentioned, being targeted left and right, di ba? Kaya lang, I tend to have a contra review about it. This is the best time to be a journalist. It's not because of the dangers. Hindi ko naman sinasabi na maging utak pulbura tayo and we embrace danger. Of course not. Pero we are being called upon to rise to the challenge of the time. And these are rare opportunities to prove our worth as a journalist, number one. Number two, for as long as we have young people like you, kayong mga campus journalists na narito ngayon, who would be not just more than willing to learn, but more than willing to fight for what is right, then I think the future of journalism and the future of press freedom is in good hands. Posible na ngayon nakokompromiso o kaya sabihin na natin tuluyang namatay o pinatay yung kalayaan sa pamamahayag dahil sa closure ng ABS-CBN, yung cyber libel conviction, at yung magiging desisyon ng Kongreso mamaya. Pero, syempre, we will fight for the restoration of press freedom in our quest to practice more responsibly the journalism profession. So, syempre, may dahilan para matakot, may dahilan para mag-alala, pero hanggat tayong lahat ay nagkakaisa at tayong lahat ay may perspektiba na walang iwanan at magdadamayan tayo, anuman yung mangyari, then I think the future of our country in general is in good hands.
Thank you, sir. Last question po mula kay Kurt Morales. As a campus journalist, what would be your advice for us to publish in a timely manner on the current issues of our country, sir?
Syempre, we have to learn the theoretical, empirical, and normative standards of the profession. Kasi you can only publish in a timely manner if you know the skills to quickly and responsibly churn out journalistic output. Kasi tandaan natin, nasa Pilipinas tayo. Maraming problemang kinakaharap yan. And in fact, the running joke among many newspapers is na sobrang dami ng problemang kinakaharap ng periodista, hindi mo alam paano ilalagay sa front page mo. So, ganun karami. Hindi ka mawawalan ng topic o ng paksa na isusulat. Kaya dapat, meron kang necessary skill in terms of multitasking in the sense that you can write not just one article but several articles in one day. Sa bulat-lat halimbawa, dahil digital kami, walang deadline yung mga tao, yung mga manunulat, at ang deadline talaga nila, as soon as matapos, sulat na kagad. And then we edit and then we upload. Ito yung tinatawag natin na history in a hurry when it comes to journalism. Because we need to make sure that we publish immediately without compromising, of course, the gatekeeping process, the fact-checking, the careful editing, and all that. So, siguro as long as you constantly practice the skill of journalism, I can tell you honestly that sa simula, pwedeng magiging mabagal kang manunulat or medyo mabagal yung proseso. But once you get the hang of it, once you know the routines that would be required of a professional journalist, everything will come to you naturally. everything will come naturally. And of course, your manner of writing will become more militant and more critical in the process for as long as you continue sharpening your skills in understanding what's happening. Kaya nga, to be a good journalist, you have to be aware of what's happening around you, and you have to be critical of everything that you read, that you watch, and you listen to.
So, ayun po, maraming salamat Sir Danny sa pagtanong po mula sa ating mga campus journalists mula sa iba't ibang mga campus publications sa ating bansa. So, ayun po, to to summarize lang din yung sinabi ni Sir Danny na bukod sa pagiging parang dalubhasa sa mundo ng periodismo bilang tayo ay mga periodista ng bayan ay tayo ay may malaking papel na kailangang na isulat at gayon din ang ipaglaban. Ang sinasabi natin dito ay maging yung bias ng journalist ay dapat bias sa katotohanan at sa masang api, hindi po ba? At gayon din bukod sa usapin ng mga teknikalidad pagdating sa mundo ng periodismo ay ating tanganan yung mas malaki nating responsibilidad. Ito ay para pagsilbihan yung mas malawak na interes ng mamamayan. So in behalf of the College Editors Guild of the Philippines, Sir Danny, maraming salamat po ngayong hapon. So, marami po kaming natutunan sa maikli po ninyong naging talk po ngayong hapon. At gayon din, babaunin po ito sigurado ng mga ating mga campus journalists bilang sa paglabas ng Zoom forum po na ito bilang mas matatag at mas matatapang na mamamahayag ng bayan.
Maraming salamat. Siguro bilang huling announcement na lang, itong PowerPoint presentation na to, I will make it publicly available, yung PDF version. So, antabayanan na lang po sa aking Facebook, Twitter account, yung link dun po sa PDF file ng presentation na ito. Maraming salamat. Mabuhay po kayo.
Okay. Thank you, Sir Danny. Salamat po. So ayun, dito na po nagtatapos ang ating talakayan ngayong hapon hinggil sa academic perspectives and press freedom during COVID-19. So ngayong hapon, nakatakdang pagbotohan ng Kongreso yung prangkisa ng ABS-CBN. So ang tansya ng ating mga kakilala at mga kulit sa media mukhang medyo parang tagilid yung pag-approve ng prangkisa ng ABS-CBN. So in preparation maghanda ang mga campus journalists na maglabas mula sa pambansang tanggapan ng College Editors Guild of the Philippines. Hinihikayat po kayo na tutulan yung itong clear na paglabag sa ating malayang pamamahayag at gayon din dahil ito ay atake sa bawat Pilipino. So muli, panghuli na lang din po pala sa darating na July 25, meron po kami in celebration of the Campus Press Freedom Week. Maglalabas po kami later on ng aming schedule. So we hope that as you participated in this event, makikita po ulit namin kayo sa mga susunod pang activities ng CEGP. So muli, maraming salamat to all campus journalists and to Sir Danilo Arao. So maraming salamat po muli at mag-ingat pong lahat. Salamat.